So let's start by looking at where the student's coming from. So they're coming from California, and they're from a fairly new public school with about 4,000 students. So one of the first things I'm thinking about as an admission officer is the context of this student. What city are they from? What state are they from? What's their family situation like? So this is really important context. So California is a large state, a lot of students coming from it. This is going to mean that this student who is applying to schools in California may be less competitive than students applying from out of state. If this student tries to apply to East Coast schools, they actually might be a little bit more competitive because it's sometimes harder to get students to switch coasts. So if I'm thinking about this from Stanford's perspective, this is part of a pool of about 50% of our applicants. But if I'm thinking about this from Harvard's perspective, this might be a much smaller percentage, so this could be an interesting student. If we look at the difference between students going to public schools and private schools, this is a large public school with 4,000 students, and basically that means that it might be difficult for this student to really stand out in his or her environment. So that can be really great because if the student does stand out, that means that they actually are somewhat more accomplished or have a really interesting kind of background, because it's very difficult to stand out among 4,000 students. And the fact that the school is new is actually really interesting to me, because it means there are leadership opportunities that may not be present in well-established schools. So that's some kind of interesting context and background. Then let's take a look at what the student's interested in majoring in: pre-med, pharmacy, and engineering. So these are all somewhat related, somewhat different. They're all sort of math and sciences, so that makes sense. I'd want to know if the school this student is applying to actually has a pharmacy program. That's something that's pretty specific. But again, it depends on where the student's applying. And then let's look at their stats. So they have a 4.0, and that's great. I'm assuming that's unweighted. And that means they very well could be near the top of their class. But it also could be weighted. And by the looks of some of their other information, I'm not sure, it very well could be weighted. Their SAT-1 is not particularly competitive from a top school's perspective. 1810 is a little bit low. That ends up being about 600 in each of the three categories. And those two combined make for not necessarily a particularly competitive student. So one of the things that someone like me would be looking for is first whether or not this student is academically competitive. And if they are, meaning they have competitive grades and testing and that kind of background, then I'm going to pay more attention to them. However, just being academically competitive isn't enough in this environment. Students really have to have a compelling element to their profile. And so that's where all of the rest of this, their extracurricular activities, their essays, their letters of recommendation, will tell me how interesting of a student they are to help push them over the edge and go from being just competitive to truly being compelling. So this sort of signals to me that this student just with the 1810 is not particularly competitive. Now if this student had something like a 2150 or 2200, then that combined with a 4.0 makes this student much more in the competitive range, especially if the 4.0 is unweighted. So that's something to consider. One thing I don't know here is where they fall within their class. Are they near the top? Are they in the middle? Top 10%? Top 5%? Hard to tell. If you take a look at their APs, you can see they've taken 5 over the course of the last 3 years. One thing to note is that these two were taken in 10th grade, after 10th grade. That's very noteworthy. Most students don't take more than one, and many don't even take one AP in 10th grade. AP World History is a kind of common one, or AP European to take in 10th. But AP Calc BC is very, very impressive to be taking in 10th. But this student got a 2 on the AP, and to me that means that the student actually wasn't ready to be taking that AP in 10th grade. And so that wasn't, I would say, a very wise decision on his or her part. Equally so, this student got a 2 in this other AP World History class. And 2s are not passing grades in APs. And so to me, it seems like this student bit off more than they could chew in 10th grade, and really don't necessarily have, didn't make a lot of wise choices in 10th grade. It might have been wiser to just pick one AP and really learn what that system is like, and then pile up the APs later on. One thing that this picture doesn't tell me, and why there are limitations with thinking about case studies on a one-on-one basis, is I don't know what the rest of the students in this school look like. You know, are they taking 5 APs in general, or are they just taking 3? Are 15 available and the student has taken 5? So those are some things that I'm going to be thinking about, how this student compares to other students in his or her class. But just by looking at these 2 and with this lower SAT, I probably would have already passed over this student. Of course, I would read the whole application, but in general, this isn't an academically strong student for some of the top schools. And then let's look at this person's extracurricular activities. So varsity tennis for 4 years, that's good because it means that they've been involved in something for multiple years. That's depth of commitment. And they're captain for 2 years. So not just 1, but 2, that's noteworthy. And captain shows that they have a leadership position, which is really positive and a great thing. They're part of CSF, NHS, and Key Club, but to me, these are really common kinds of activities that students pursue, and there's no leadership here. And everything you see is really based within the school. And so, to me, nothing's really emerging as being particularly interesting or compelling about this particular student. To make this student more compelling, so we already talked about what would make this student more competitive. To make this student more compelling, I'd really want to see other extracurricular activities with a lot of depth, multiple years, and also with leadership, both inside the school and outside the school. I don't have a lot to go from here, but you know, if they had done something interesting in pharmacy work, maybe they had an internship or shadowed somebody, or you know, were involved in developing a website for a pharmacy even. There could be a number of interesting things this student could do to help further his or her interests. Because again, ultimately what I'd be looking for is how do all these pieces come together to have certain themes emerge from the student's profile. So I'll stop there. My general assessment is, as is, this student is not even competitive, let alone compelling. But with certain things, this student could be competitive, but there's a lot of work to be done to make this student compelling. So that's sort of the first case study. So let's take a look at the next.